The text for this morning's sermon is from the book of Mark, chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." This is the word of the Lord. And the theme for this morning's sermon is Jesus calls Levi. But I hope you'll understand that this is not simply an interesting anecdote about something that happened long ago and far away to a fellow named Levi, but that this is our story, my story, your story, the story of God's call to discipleship. As one New Testament interpreter has put it, when Jesus selected people to be on his team, as it were, he did not choose only the best people. In fact, the gospel writers point out how often Jesus chose the ones that no one else wanted. This account of Jesus calling Levi is a wonderful example of what happens, he writes, when Jesus chooses a sinner to follow him. So I invite you to join me in taking a look together at this wonderful example of what happens when Jesus chooses a sinner to follow him. Verse 13 reads, "Jesus went out again beside the lake. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them." Jesus went out again beside the lake. Jesus was repeatedly going to the lake. He was a lake person. Recall that earlier in the Gospel of Mark, he went to the lake shore, and there he called the first disciples, Simon, later to be called Peter, Andrew, James, and John. After he called these four fishermen to discipleship, Jesus went into the village of Capernaum, where he spent some time teaching and healing people. Then he withdrew to a secluded place to be alone in prayer. And then he left the secluded place and went back to the lake shore. It's reported that the whole crowd gathered around him, a sort of archaic way of saying a large crowd. And so he taught them there by the lake shore. In verse 14, the story gets more complicated and more interesting. As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. There are a lot of narrative details packed into this one small verse. First, notice that it was as he was walking along that Jesus became interrupted and stopped to deal with an individual in need. So often this happens in the Gospels, that Jesus and the disciples are hurriedly on their way to someplace else. They have a schedule to keep, appointments to make, but then something comes along and the whole procession of Jesus and disciples stops while Jesus turns his attention to this individual. We saw this in last week's text. For those who were here, recall that Jesus and the disciples were hurrying along when suddenly some people were pushing children forward for Jesus to bless them. The disciples were upset. "Jesus, look at the clock. We have appointments to keep. We need to be on our way." And Jesus said simply, the importance of my responding to this individual's needs far surpasses the itinerary that's been printed out for us. And so it's a good reminder to all of us, isn't it, not to be itinerary and schedule driven, but to be driven by human compassion and response to human needs. For sometimes, the New Testament reports, God may be sending an angel into our lives by this way. So it was as he was walking along, he saw Levi. Levi's not one of those who interrupted Jesus and said, I need help, I need healing, I need guidance. But rather, Jesus saw Levi and something about this man who needed his intervention. He was sitting at the tax booth. Now, just a word or two about tax collectors. These people occur so often in the Gospels, and if you're a regular, have heard me talk about this before. So let me just say quickly that tax collectors in New Testament times were not government officials like IRS employees are now, but rather they were hated because they were locals. They were friends and neighbors who chose to collaborate with the Roman occupiers in this matter of getting taxes from the local population. People hated tax collectors not because they were against taxes as such, but because they were collaborators. And throughout human history, the most despised people in any society have been those who were collaborating with occupying forces for their own personal gain. So tax collectors were despised people, but Jesus looked at this fellow Levi and said, "Follow me." Now that doesn't surprise us, because Jesus said to many people, "Follow me." That's the call of God and Jesus Christ to us all. Follow me. The surprising part comes next. He got up and followed him. Levi didn't say, "Let me think about that for a while. Let me mull that over. Let me pray about that. Let me consult with my family about that." He got up and followed. And so we have here, first of all, a witness to the compelling, beguiling, powerful presence of Jesus Christ. But we also see in Levi a person who Jesus knew was at a point in his life, what the educators call it, a teachable moment, when this call was what Levi most needed to hear. I date myself mercilessly by quoting Neil Diamond lyrics, but some of you are old enough to remember that song. I have an emptiness deep inside, and I've tried, but it won't let me go. Okay. There was Levi. The character Voynetsky in Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya says, "All living things revive and breathe more freely except me. Nothing revives me. Day and night my thoughts choke me, haunt me with the specter of a life hopelessly wasted, a life I've never lived. My past life has been thrown away on stupid trivialities, and the present is so futile, it appalls me." Now there's a depressed guy. That was Levi. You reach a point where you fall so low, you can't fall any lower. Betty and I just saw the new Woody Allen film, Blue Jasmine. It's a great film if you're a Woody Allen fan to begin with. I think that's an acquired taste. If you're not committed to begin with, you might not like the film. But in this film, the character Jasmine, played by the incomparable Cate Blanchett, is a very troubled woman, and at one point she says, "Anxiety, nightmares, and a nervous breakdown. There are just so many traumas a person can withstand," until they take to the streets and start screaming. Okay? Jesus somehow understood that this fellow Levi was on the verge of taking to the streets and start screaming. And so, "Come follow me." And Levi stood up and followed. Now, people probably didn't take much notice of this because it's almost a cliche that people make religious commitments but then don't keep them, right? They come forward at a revival and recommit their lives to Jesus Christ, but then back home within a day or two, it all seems to disappear. Church summer camps. I spent a lot of my life working at church summer camps, and that Friday night around the campfire where young people renew their belief in Jesus Christ, and they're exchanging addresses, and they're hugging and crying and promising to be best friends forever. Then they go back home, school begins, and what was the name of that person I knew at the camp? So we're people who make firm commitments, or we think they're firm, and then we don't keep them. In fact, it would be an interesting story to know what happens when Levi went home and talked to Mrs. Levi, right? And all the little Levi's, and said, this house we live in, these fine clothes, the vacations we take, the big screen TV, all of that has to go because I'm following Jesus now. Oh, really? So when Levi committed his life to Jesus Christ, that did not attract much attention. But what happens next did attract attention. Verse 15. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Levi invited Jesus to come to his home for a meal. Now, that was sketchy enough that Jesus would have a meal with this despised scoundrel. That was shocking and disgraceful to respectable people in the culture. But when Jesus arrived, there was a room full of people. Look what happened. Levi invited all his partners in crime to come to the meal. It's like Levi was saying to his other rascal and scoundrel friends, look, this life we have chosen has rewarded us well. But I've come to know that this life is a corrupt life. It's an unsatisfactory life. There is a better way to live, a higher way, a holier way. I'm following this person, Jesus. Won't you come to dinner at my house and at least hear what he has to say? So Jesus steps into the dining room, and it's filled with people. Now, none of this is a new idea. As we heard from the book of Leviticus, it's as old as Scripture itself, this idea that we are called to be holy and honorous and gentle and generous and kind, not because these are good ideas, although they are astonishingly good ideas, but because this is how God is. God is holy and honest and gentle and generous and kind. And so just as God has redeemed us lovingly, so we ought to be in the world as a redemptive, loving presence to other people. So none of this was a new idea. But it was shocking to those observing to see Jesus sitting down, not just with one rascal, Levi, but with a whole table of them. And so the story continues, verse 16. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? The religious leaders could not understand this. That Jesus wasn't just hanging out with rascals and scoundrels, with notorious public oppressors, but he was actually breaking bread with them. Now, later in the Gospels, we would see the Pharisees become angry and defensive and begin to strategize on how to bring Jesus down. But we're only in Mark chapter 2 here. They're not angry yet. They're genuinely puzzled. And so they ask the question, why does he do this? Why? But notice, they don't ask him. Notice they ask the disciples. You know, you've heard me say this so many times, you'll be so glad when Dave's committee's work is done and I'm out of here and you won't hear this again, right? But, you know, we call this triangulation. When one person has a problem with another person, instead of dealing with the person directly, they triangulate in a third person. Right? Instead of A talking to B, they talk to C about B. You with me? This is absolutely toxic behavior to any organization. It's toxic in families, it's toxic in workplaces, it's toxic in churches. It's exactly what the Pharisees do here. They've got a question to ask Jesus, they don't ask him. They go to the Pharisees and say, tell us about him. And Jesus, remarkable Jesus, he knows what's going on. And so he's standing at a distance, and as though he's saying, did I hear my name mentioned? Do you have something you want to know? Don't ask them about me. Come talk to me. I'm right here. And so Jesus anticipates what their problem is. He answers their question before they can even phrase it. He said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners. Or as he would later say, there's more joy in heaven over one who was lost and found than over 99 who were never lost. So, as we gather at this table this morning, let's imagine ourselves as taking our place with those rascals and scoundrels at Levi's table. That we may receive at this table not only refreshment for our bodies, but we might receive at this table the opportunity to choose a new way of life. And just as Levi said to his friends, we don't have to live this way. We can choose a higher, holier way. Let us at this table resolve to choose a higher, holier way.